All right, welcome back to yet another installment of the Profit Pro Plus training system. Today we're going to focus on recipes, and more specifically, in this episode, we're going to look at batch recipes and how to build them and why. So let's dive into our program and get started. Instead of hitting enter or the default button, which is going to land me on inventory, I'm going to start by clicking right where I want to go, which is the recipes icon. And here we are in our recipe page. So let's talk about how we got here and what already exists. So one of the initial steps to setting up the program is to load up your inventory data as well as loading in your PMix sales data. Now this is critical. If we don't upload our PMix sales data, we won't have a way to auto-populate our menu recipes and our columns. Now this is critical because the recipes we might have in a book could vary quite a bit from what's in our PMix sales. For example, you might have special items in your POS system like a half order of something because a guest orders that quite a bit, but it's not on the menu. If we don't load the PMix categories from our POS system and all of those individual POS items that you charge for, then we'll be missing some recipe cards and our recipe data will be incomplete, which will not allow us to capture the proper pricing of our food cost. We might be able to figure out the food cost on an individual item if we manually enter it, but we will not be able to figure out how all of it blends together and how to identify our variance and our gaps between what our food costs should be. And then after we look at our inventory, our purchases, and our recipe portions and our sales, we can then identify what our actual food cost is, identify those gaps where they're coming from. Could be a bad recipe, could be bad data coming from the POS system, or it could be lack of portion control or a number of other things that will show invariance based on our invoices. In our subsequent training, we've already loaded our inventory, which we can see our entire list. We've loaded our PMix sales, but our PMix sales won't show up here until we've populated our recipes. However, when loading our PMix sales, that is what populated all of our recipe items. Before we can start building our recipe items, the first thing that we have to do is build some batch recipes. In this example, I've got a very simple quick service Mexican food style concept that we're going to build from so that we can see exactly the methodology and the process behind this. So let's go to our batch recipes and start building some batches. Under batch recipe, we're going to select new. And in new, the first thing that I need to build for my quick service Mexican food concept is my salsa. After I put in salsa, I'm going to want to assign the category. The recipe type is a batch, and the category is not defined. So what I need to do is define some categories. I specifically want to have a couple of categories in my batch recipes. So I'm going to create a category. I'm going to add a new category by clicking on the maintenance button and selecting the categories option. When it takes me to the categories screen, you could see these are the categories that came over from my menu. Here in recipe type, they're all defined as menu. I want to create batch categories. For example, your prep might be an extensive list, anywhere from sauces and dressings and produce to marinades based on our specific need. In my new category, the recipe type is going to be a batch and the category is going to be sauces, which I will consider anything that is a dressing, a sauce, a salsa, etc. I'm going to save it, and here it falls in alphabetical order on my list. Next, I'm going to do another category. In this category, I'm going to call marinades. And now you can see that that has fallen alphabetically in my list. And I think the last one that I'm going to create is produce. So prepped produce will be something where I'm going to mix multiple ingredients, like maybe a salad mix or a pico de gallo, for example. I'm going to hit save. Now I can see I've got my different recipe types, menus, and batches, and my different recipe categories. So now I'm ready to go back to my recipes and start building my batches. So you can see this automatically identified my categories. I'm ready to build my salsa. So at the top, I'm going to click New, and my recipe name is going to be salsa. I'm going to do it under batches as a recipe type, and I'm going to do it under sauces right here. Now I'm going to click Save, and you'll see a tree arrow icon just expanded underneath sauces. I can click any of these arrows at any time to hide all of the stuff that's in here, or I can open it up individually so that when I want to look at a specific category, I can just look at that category. So now that my salsa is highlighted, I'm ready to start adding ingredients. So let's build the recipe. From the Add Ingredients button, we will get a box like this. All we simply have to do is click on the item and start typing the first ingredient that we're looking for. For me, I'm looking for tomatoes to start my batch recipe of salsa. And I use this tomato chopped, peeled in juice. And the quantity for my salsa is going to be 6 number 10 cans, which I know that my entire yield out of that can is 104 ounces. So I'm going to use 624 ounces in this recipe. You'll see that it automatically extends my extension total. I'm going to hit Save. This will take me back to my recipe card. I'm ready to add my next ingredient. Now I'm going to go to garlic. I use this natural garlic chopped in water. I'm going to use 10 ounces of that in my recipe. I'll click Save, and I'm ready for my next ingredient. I'm going to use cilantro, and we use 4 ounces of cilantro. Next, I'm going to add my salt, and we're going to use 2 ounces of salt. Next, I'm going to add my onion, 16 ounces of onion. Now I'm going to add my jalapeno, and we're also going to use 16 ounces of jalapeno. Next, I'm going to add some lime juice, and we're going to use 8 ounces of lime juice. As an example, this will pretty much wrap up my salsa recipe. I'll click Save, and when I click back on salsa, now I'm ready to type in my yield. The number of recipes is how you want to account for the portion. Because I use salsa in so many different ways, I could serve one dish with 2 ounces, while I could serve my chips and salsa with 4 ounces. So I'm going to do this by my total ounces, and for this particular exercise, you could see that if we added up all of these ingredients, they still may not equal the exact yield. So we need to know our yields when we're building our recipes. For this particular yield, I have 654 ounces of total product yield. That yield is 100% based on this recipe, and the recipe unit is going to be ounces. In my container, I don't have any options pre-selected. The way that we do this is a 5-gallon container, and the number of containers I get out of one recipe is 1. And I'm going to set my shelf life because this is going to come later into focus when it comes to the amount of prep and how you make your par sheets when it comes to prep. So for my shelf life, I get 5 days out of this recipe. Now I'm going to click Save. Now the beauty of this item is when I'm ready to go start building a recipe item, let's take a look at my burrito. And I'm going to build my chicken burrito. You will see that when I go to add an ingredient, if I type in salsa, my batch item is now in the recipe. So this is how we migrate the batch recipe items down into the menu recipe items, and that's why we have to build our batch recipe items first. I'm going to cancel this one because we're going to come back and focus on menu recipes in a different training. In the meantime, I'm going to continue to build the rest of my batch recipes, and we'll take a look at a couple of other examples. Okay, so aside from building our batch recipe and being able to add our batches to our menu recipes, we can also add batches to other batches. So let's do that really quick. I've got a pico de gallo that we're going to make, and in my pico, let's start by hitting the new button, and this is going to be Pico de Gallo. And here it's going to be under batches, and our category is going to be under produce. Now I'm going to hit save, and under produce is my Pico de Gallo. So now I'm ready to add ingredients. First, I'm going to start with some onions, and I'm going to use 2 pounds of onions, or 32 ounces. Save that item. Next, I'm going to add some tomatoes. Now, for these particular tomatoes, I'm going to dice my own. I'm going to use Cafe Bulk No. 2 tomatoes, and I'm going to use 5 pounds of those tomatoes, or 80 ounces. I'll hit save. Next, I'm going to add cilantro, and you could see just by simply typing the name of the ingredient you're looking for, it auto finds it and brings it into the system. So I'm going to use 2 ounces of this product. And last, I'm going to use a little bit of garlic. I'm going to use just 1 ounce. And now my special ingredient for my Pico de Gallo, I am going to add some of my salsa that I already made. In this particular recipe, I'm going to put in 10 ounces of my salsa. I'm going to save it. Now that my batch is done, I hit save. When I click back over here on Pico de Gallo, this population box pops up that gives me the opportunity again to enter my number of recipe units. So I'm going to do this just like I did the last one, and I'm going to say my total batch yields out the exact yield as the number of ingredients I have at 125 ounces. Because I've put ounces in before, it shows up. My yield is 100%. My container is going to be a 3rd pan. And again, we don't put any of the containers in from a huge list for you to pick. You just type in whatever it is you call your container. Once you put it in once, that item will end up in the list, like we did in the previous recipe, which had a 5-gallon bucket. And our number of containers for this is going to be 2 containers. And our shelf life on our Pico de Gallo is 3 days. Now I hit save, and that information will be there when I come back to it. Just as was our salsa, so too is our Pico de Gallo. So that gives you an opportunity to look at how to build some of the batch recipes and what you can do with them. Beyond that, we can also go look at our batch recipes in our inventory. I can type in salsa. I can look through my search function and say that it contains, and voila, here's my salsa. It's identified as the category, the brand, and the brand code is a batch. This one is a little different. I cannot edit it from my inventory list. I can only edit it from the recipe card. The reason why we put it in inventory is because you're going to count the items you purchase just as well as you're going to count the items that you make. Beyond that, it is now an inventory item so that you can put it into your recipes, your menu recipes or other batch recipes, and that's why it falls to this master list. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how to build the batch recipes and how the logic of the batch recipes work. I'll clear my filter really quick, go back to my entire list, and here we are back in our regular inventory list. Back down to recipes, and now I have, for the purposes of this exercise, all of my batch recipes built. So now we're ready to move on to the menu recipes. Stay tuned for that training, and we'll see you then.